This video is for chapter 6 of your textbook. This chapter is on sexuality. Before we get into the material, just a reminder that in some ways this chapter builds upon the last chapter on gender because for many people, they sometimes conflate the terms that are used to describe gender versus sex versus sexual orientation. I discussed this in more detail in chapter 5 when discussing the distinction between the terms gender and sex. In this chapter, we're adding the term sexual orientation. So your chapter begins with a kind of discussion about how our society, particularly, of course, America, has changed and shifted our attitudes, our awareness, our acknowledgement of people that uh, have a sexual orientation beyond heterosexual. And to kind of illustrate that change, the story of Ellen DeGeneres and her very public coming out back when she used to have a scripted TV show, that story was provided. And the fact that although she initially faced a lot of blowback and her TV show was canceled. Obviously, she went on to have a very successful daytime talk show. And her marriage to her wife, Portia de Rossi, is was celebrated and so just in the span of a few decades, obviously a lot can change. And so Cohen notes that sexuality is seen as being an expression of free choice, that it's less rigidly constrained than what it's been in the past. And that this new openness about sexuality, along with the feeling of uncertainty that comes with that growing individual freedom, obviously this can play out in the family arena. It doesn't just change family structures and family dynamics, but it makes certain types of families possible in a way that they were not, like I said, even just a decade ago. So the first part of this chapter is very brief. It just kind of discusses the sociological approach to studying sexuality. How we study it, why we study it. And so your book notes that for a lot of sociologists that study sexuality, they focus on identities, particularly how people identify with sex categories and sexual orientation, and how, especially if your sexual orientation um, kind of positions you as being a sexual minority in society, sociologists will kind of, seek to understand how that impacts you, how that affects your daily life, how you're treated, how you're perceived in a variety of social institutions. Um, but they also mention that there is increasing awareness and understanding that these identities are closely related to human biology. And so there are a growing number of sociologists that seek to understand the relationship between identity and biology. For sociologists that are very interested in that type of intersection, we even have a term for that type of sociology. We call it sociobiology. And so the fact that there is this kind of growing sense that in order to understand sexual behavior, we need to not just understand identity, but we also need to understand to what extent does biology impact or not impact that sexual behavior. So particularly in the realm of sexuality, the sociology of sexuality, you are starting to see kind of a growing presence of the group that we call sociobiologists. So, a large part of this chapter is about sexual orientation, and that is the kind of pattern of romantic or sexual attraction to others in relation to one's own gender identity. We sometimes think about this as being like these separate, desperate, check boxes. I am this, I am that. But research suggests it's better to understand this in terms of being like a continuum that can describe attraction and behavior from one end of the continuum, which would be like exclusively heterosexual, to the other end of the continuum, which would be exclusive homosexual. And then there are all these variations in between that represent not just like this one identity of bisexuality, but like this kind of variation of bisexual identity and behavior. But despite kind of the acknowledgement in the worlds of academia and research that sexual orientation is a continuum, of course, we often, like I said, we talk about it like it is these separate identity check boxes. And so oftentimes, we expect people to identify as either being heterosexual, or what we refer to as straight, or homosexual, which we use the term gay, and gay can refer to both men and women, or lesbian, which of course refers to women only. Bisexuality is not as widely recognized of an identity. Um, uh, and sometimes there can be a lot of pushback and pressure from both heterosexual as well as homosexual communities for people who are bisexual to kind of pick a side, which of course just reflects a kind of deep misunderstanding of bisexuality, both as a behavior but also as a sexual identity. And in recent years, there has been a kind of plethora of new sexual identity terms that have kind of grown in prominence and recognition. One of them is a variation of bisexuality called pansexuality. And kind of the main distinction between bisexuality and pansexuality is that your attractions aren't limited to two fixed gender categories, because even with homosexuality, heterosexuality, and bisexuality, those terms are rooted in identification with gender terms based in the binary, right? So it's this idea that you have a fixed gender, and are you interested sexually, romantically in someone who has the same or so-called opposite fixed gender identity comparative to you. Pansexuality, of course, is kind of trying to account for the fact that we also now, recognize this plethora of gender-related terms: gender fluid, non-binary, gender queer. And so, in order to now describe people's sexual attraction, whether they themselves, identify with one of those non-binary terms, or whether they are sexually romantically attracted to someone who embraces kind of one of those non-binary gender identities. This is why pansexuality is needed, as opposed to just using the more traditional heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality. A small percentage of people, profess to have no sexual attraction to people at all, regardless of gender. And we refer to those people as having an asexual identity. And so this is a fairly emerging category of sexual identity. And people who embrace it are kind of pushing back against the idea that not experiencing sexual attraction is not a disorder. It can just be an identity. Traditionally, we've treated this as a sexual disorder. And now, of course, it's kind of being reclaimed and redefined as being a sexual identity. And so, all of these identities have their own separate meaning, but oftentimes we will speak about sexual and gender minorities, as a community, and this is where you get the alphabet train, if you will. For a long time, it was the LGB community: lesbian, gay, bisexual. Then, in terms of gender, they added the T for trans, and now you might see it LGBTQ, where you've added the Q for queer, LGBTQI, where I stands for intersex, LGBTQIA A, where the A stands for asexual, and then sometimes, of course, then you just see the plus being added, which is meant to account for all of those other gender and sexual identity terms, that are uh, becoming increasingly adopted and recognized. Um, Now, it's worth noting, of course, as we're speaking about sexual orientation, which really is about identity, this isn't the same as sexual behavior. And so there are people who don't identify as gay or lesbian, but they have had sexual relationships with people of the same sex. And we know this because we have survey research, and large scale surveys on sexual orientation are relatively new, meaning that if you go far enough back, you aren't going to find questions where people are asking people their sexual orientation. So this is why we sometimes can't speak about the differences between heterosexuals and homosexuals, or homosexuals and bisexuals, in regards to specific taste or beliefs or behaviors, because that isn't a question that was routinely put on a lot of large scale survey instruments. But certainly, and we'll talk more about the Kinsey research later on in this chapter video, but certainly post 1950s into the 1960s, we have started to have research meant to address sexuality and sexual behavior. And it is from this research that we were able to glean the observation that sexual orientation is not a fixed quality that people just have. That same gender sexual attraction and behavior does occur outside of people who adopt the label of homosexual or bisexual, and that it's more common among men, or at least it's more readily admitted to or it's more common among women comparative to men, or at least it's more readily admitted to among women as compared to men. And also that this has grown more common with time. And once again, we aren't necessarily certain if the behavior has grown more common with time, or if just if people's willingness to be open about it on survey research has grown more common. So how one defines homosexual orientation is going to affect the number of people who are considered to be homosexual. As researchers, if we're looking at the data and we decide to define it as anyone who's had any amount of same-sex attraction or has engaged in same-sex sexual behavior, that's going to give us a much higher percentage of people that we would consider to be homosexual than if we allow people to self-identify. And if we're looking just at identity and largely exclusive homosexual behavior, this occurs in less than about 5% of American adults. So 5% does not sound like a lot, and it's certainly not the majority, but, this is a sizable minority, especially if you think about just the size of the American adult population. We are still, talking about millions of people who identify as homosexual, and of course there are millions more who do not necessarily identify as exclusively homosexual, but consider themselves as falling somewhere along that continuum outside of being exclusively heterosexual, and our survey research on their sexual behaviors kind of supports that claim. So, you perhaps noticed that I said several times, we're not really sure. Has the behavior changed that much? Has are there truly more people identifying, or are people just feeling like it is safer, and it's more acceptable to admit to that behavior, and to adopt that identity? Is that what our research is picking up on? And that's because, for a very long time in American history, and certainly even to some extent, even today, particularly depending on what part of the country you're living in. Are you living in a rural versus urban area, right? There is still a lot of stigma that exist around homosexuality, and then of course homophobia, and these are terms that your book discusses. So stigma is kind of a broader term because a lot of different qualities and characteristics can be stigmatized in a society. Stigma is a quality that's perceived as undesirable, and it sets a person apart from others in his or her social category. So stigma is not unique to homosexuality. You can think about other characteristics in our society that have been stigmatized, are still stigmatized today. That people are pushing to be less stigmatized. Everything from being a certain racial or religious minority to obesity to disability, people qualities that we now don't necessarily think about as being stigmatized certainly used to be more stigmatized in the past. So stigma isn't unique to homosexuality, but like I said, for most of our history, homosexuality has been stigmatized, and depending upon where you live and your social network, your social connections, it still might be stigmatized in varying degrees even today. Homophobia, of course, is a term specifically related to sexuality, and that is the fear or antipathy towards homosexuality, which basically just means hatred in general, and particularly gays and lesbians in particular. So it's saying, it's hatred of homosexual behavior, but particularly a hatred towards people who are exclusively engaged in that behavior, who adopt the identity of being homosexual. And so, when you think about, homophobia, it can contribute to prejudice, it can contribute to discrimination in a variety of arenas, housing, education, work. It can contribute to violence. And so this is why sexual orientation, homosexuality for a very long time, has been very difficult to study because there is this stigma, around it. And, people who identify as homosexual, they have very valid concerns related to experiencing homophobia, even in so-called, anonymous surveys, just it does take a certain amount of bravery to kind of put yourself out there and identify as such when you aren't certain how it's going to change, how people see you, how they treat you, what they think about you. Some other terms that are lesser known, I think, than stigma and homophobia, but are terms that come up in academia, particularly, and as well as activist circles when we're talking about sexual orientation, are the terms heteronormativity and compulsory heterosexuality. So in our society, in Anglo-European societies, we really link gender and sexual orientation. We shouldn't, but we do. We define masculinity and femininity to a certain extent through sexual orientation, that whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, the expectation is that you're going to be heterosexual. And so we take this link between gender and heterosexuality for granted. It's the idea that, if we recognize you as a man, then our expectation is that you are going to be attracted to women. And if we perceive you as being a woman, then the kind of default expectation is that you're going to be attracted to a man. And this is what we mean when we say heteronormativity, the assumption that everyone is straight and that normal families and just the structure of society is built around heterosexual relationships. And you can see this in a variety of ways. The joking that we do with little children when they have, cross sex friendships. Oh, that's your little boyfriend, that's your little girlfriend, right? Kind of imprinting upon them at an early age, heterosexuality. As somebody that was on a lot of prom courts and in homecoming courts, for this idea that there's a king and a queen, not a king and a king and not a queen and a queen, that's kind of built around it. Dolls and cake toppers, they automatically come in this heterosexual pairing, or they build stories around this heterosexual pairing. All of this is what we mean when we say heteronormative. And going along with this idea of heteronormativity is that gender and the link between gender and heterosexuality is basically taken for granted, is this idea that heterosexuality is compulsory. So compulsory heterosexuality just focuses on the idea that heterosexuality is the default or obligatory sexuality. It's the one that in our society has the institutional privileges, the one that we recognize, the one that we expect people to uphold, the one that if you are not heterosexual, you're expect to make that clear, because otherwise it's considered to be perfectly acceptable that folks assume that you are in fact heterosexual. And a good way to kind of emphasize this, and this is an activity that I would sometimes do in my gender classes, is comparing how we talk about heterosexuality to homosexuality. So no one really says, when did you know you were straight? While when did you know you were gay is a common question. And it is a privilege to not have to explain your sexual behaviors and desires. The fact that you don't have to explain that is what we mean when we say that society is heteronormative. So there is this questionnaire, and I'm not going to pretend like I created this. Someone did, and it floats around the internet. And there are more questions than these 5, but I feel like these 5 help just kind of illustrate the point. So if thinking about the questions that we often ask of people that are homosexual or bisexual, think about how nonsensical it is when we substitute homosexuality for heterosexuality. What do you think caused your heterosexuality? When and how did you first decide you were a heterosexual? Is it possible your heterosexuality is just a phase you may grow out of? If you've never slept with a person of the same sex, how can you be sure you wouldn't prefer that? Why do you insist on flaunting your heterosexuality? Can't you just be what you are and keep it quiet? Right. So if you're reading these questions and say, well, that sounds ridiculous, just this is what we mean when we say that society is heteronormative. And this is what we mean when we say that society is kind of predicated upon compulsory heterosexuality, right? These questions only sound ridiculous because you've been raised in a society where heterosexuality, the expectation that everyone is heterosexual has been kind of successfully embedded, in our psyches and in our social structures. And this is why there is no heterosexual version of coming out. When you're expected to be heterosexual, like, what would you be coming out about? Like, just confirming people's assumption. But this is why for people who are not heterosexual, there is this pressure where, you have to come out to people, not just strangers, but even like, your loved ones, your families and your friends. You have to reveal that you are gay. And so this process, looks differently, depending on the individual, depending on, how supportive their family and friends and their larger social spaces are. And so for some in supportive families in areas that have a strong, gay, thriving gay community, this may not be as stressful or as anxiety inducing, but certainly for a lot of young people, it is stressful, it is isolating. And if you've watched any of those videos that pop up on YouTube, some families do handle it really badly. They are they kick their children out their homes. They cut them off, financially as well as communication. And so this is just one way in which, of course, as your textbook notes, that the rapid pace of change and cultural attitudes towards homosexualities has impacted families. A Pew Research Center poll um, ask questions about the coming out experience. And so, if you're interested, you can look up the entire report, but this just kind of shows you, you know, at what age do people maybe first begin to expect that they are homosexuality? When did they know for sure? And, when did they first tell someone? And, and I think it's probably pretty telling that almost everyone, at least in this poll, that the average age for coming out, for telling someone, was over the age of 18. Because, of course, it's not that you need your friends and families less, but you're certainly less dependent upon them once you are technically an adult. That even though people knew, as early as 15, as 17, and suspected as early as 10 and 13, no one was necessarily sharing it with people that early, probably because of the risk of being isolated, the risk of being cut off, the risk of being stigmatized, and experiencing that homophobia. So the first article that I'm asking you to read really is just about that coming out experience. It kind of talks about the history of coming out. I thought it was pretty interesting, as if, because maybe our perception today of what it means to come out has been kind of heavily influenced by, like I said, viral videos and YouTube, and the fact that we have celebrities and we have public service campaigns like, it gets better. But, I would think that a lot of us don't really know the history of that term. So that was kind of my thoughts about why I chose that article for you all to read. So, with that kind of touch on history, let's have a little bit of a history lesson about sexual orientation. Some of this is from your textbook, a lot of this is not. So, this is a part of the video that if it were me and I was watching and I was taking notes, that I would pay closer attention and maybe write some things down. So, it's worth noting that heterosexuality and homosexuality are relatively recent concepts. And that's not because people weren't engaging in, sexual acts that could be defined as heterosexual or homosexual. They certainly were, but for a very long period of time in human history, engaging in these types of sexual acts did not define you as a person. Like, we did not see this sexual behavior as being a form of identity. So it wasn't until kind of the Victorian era, so the late 1800s, early 1900s, that these terms were invented by sexologists. And it's worth noting that's also, this time period is when we begin as that this sexology as a discipline, as a research interest, began to somewhat kind of take off, because people were studying sexual behavior in a more systematic way. And so, they wanted to name, what they saw as being some patterns in behavior. And so this is where we get the terms heterosexuality and homosexuality. And it's important because this is, literally the beginning of sexual identities. And it's worth noting that, almost from the beginning, homosexuality was kind of seen as a stigmatized and deviant identity, going as far as it being classified as a mental disorder or a mental disease by the American Psychiatric Association. They listed it as such in the DSM, which is kind of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's related. It's how psychiatrists diagnose mental disorders. It was listed as being a mental disorder. And so really, so this is like the early 1900s. Um, yeah, a lot of this behavior, there was a time period in the 1920s, where, along with other kind of loosening sexual mores, and greater freedoms that kind of came out of the Roaring Twenties, there started to be a little bit more space, around, and freedom for people who are homosexual, but it still carried, great risk. A lot of states, and cities had laws and policies against sodomy, or what they call buggery. So, people who were homosexual, they were at risk of social ostracism, they were at risk of imprisonment, and they were at risk of, being social pariahs, in a variety of ways. So it really wasn't until the end of the 1960s that we really have like a large scale pushback against this type of treatment, where we have people basically kind of, saying, hey, the problem isn't homosexuality, it's the discrimination that people who are gay face. And certainly, one event that is really significant in this time period that we refer to as the gay rights movement is the Stonewall riot. And I give you like the shortest little 2-minute video, that kind of, that kind of gives you some details there. But basically, the Stonewall riot it takes place in a bar in New York, and it had been a long summer of basically the police just harassing, gay patrons, that harassing them at the bars and clubs that, people who were gay were, known or suspected, to frequent. And so they would, harass the club, shut it down early, arrest people. And finally, one night, people were just like, we've had enough, and they fought back against the police. A riot occurred, and it actually wasn't one riot. It was, it lasted over a series of days, and kind of based off of this, the homosexual community and their allies kind of came together later that year to form what was called the Gay Liberation Front. So this was kind of the first, activist organization, that was established to fight for, gay rights. And so if you've ever heard the slogan or seen it on a t-shirt, gay is good, that was a slogan, that came out of the Gay Liberation Front. They engaged in all the type of activism, that was becoming increasingly common for the time period, for the 60s and the 70s. Think about the civil rights movement, think about the women's movement, Black Power movement, the Brown Power movement, the Red Power movement. There were so many movements. So, this would include, marches, this would include boycotts, this would include demonstrations. And, they did have some pretty clear successes. Homosexuality was declassified, by the APA as a mental disorder in 1973. So it was removed, from, the DSM. And you had your first openly gay politician elected, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the city of San Francisco in 1977. You have the emergence of gayborhoods in places like San Francisco, in New York, in Chicago, places where, gay people were, rent and bought and openly, you know, um, went to restaurants and clubs, and did not have to hide in the shadows and be afraid, about, facing homophobia, because largely they were in spaces that were geared towards them. And it was actually during this time period that the term homophobia was introduced, to the larger lexicon, to, explain and understand, the discrimination and the prejudice that people who, identified as homosexual faced. Now, one thing, I did not mean for that to play. Okay, so part of why, these early successes of the gay rights movement, um, it it didn't kind of continue on, unchecked progress did not kind of continue on, because, within a decade of the gay rights movement and some of the wins from the gay rights movement, the AIDS epidemic happened. And so, what is AIDS? It's caused by the HIV. It's caused by HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus. And the virus will progress to the point where then you have AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And it's often but not always sexually transmitted. In the earlier years, there also was a risk of it being transmitted through like blood transfusions, uh, and of course changes in how blood is collected and screened and monitored pretty much fairly quickly made that way of acquiring HIV obsolete. To this day, in addition to sexual intercourse, the other way that you might see HIV being transmitted is through injection needles, injection drug use. And today, as well as in the past, a lot of the cases of AIDS did result from men having sex with other men. For women, the greatest source of new cases is sex with men. The transmission between women having sex with other women is very low, like so minimal that as you can see, it's not even necessarily represented on the charts. And the trend in cases now, of course, is that it's decreasing, the number of cases as well as the number of deaths. It's not so much the treatment in some cases has become so effective, we don't want to use the word a cure, not that there is a cure for AIDS, but the treatment has become so successful, it does allow people to control the disease and live for a very long time. But that was not the case in the 80s and the 90s. In the 80s and the 90s, it was a death sentence, and in some cases, a very quick death sentence. And a death sentence that heavily disproportionately fell upon the gay male community. And, for public health scholars, public health historians looking back on this time period, you know, there is some culpability here of the United States government. They were very slow to respond to the AIDS crisis in a kind of in a national kind of unified type of way in terms of providing the needed research and resources. And a lot of people certainly suggest that AIDS wasn't given serious attention until the epidemic started to spread into the heterosexual population. And of course, it spread into the heterosexual population largely because, once again, sexual behavior is a continuum. People who were men who were sleeping with men, not all of them were only sleeping with men, but they were sleeping with women who, were sleeping with men. And so this is how people who did not engage in same sex relations found themselves having a disease that at one point was believed to be solely limited to the gay male population. And it was even referred to as GRID, gay related immune deficiency. But ultimately it wound up, being clear that that wasn't the case. As I've noted, since the 80s, there has been a lot of medical and technological advances in treatment. And while it is still the most lethal of all the STIs, and we'll talk about some of the other STIs towards the end of this presentation, it's no longer the death sentence that it once was. And so if you think about, the fact that there was the gay rights movement with all of its kind of successes in terms of increasing recognition of sexual minorities, trying to push back against discrimination. But then within about 10 years of that movement, or not even 10 years, you have the rise of the AIDS epidemic, which really was devastating to the community. It kind of explains why the topic that so many of us maybe associate with homosexual activism wasn't really a focus back then. And that's, of course, marriage rights. Marriage rights did not become a prominent issue for most gays and lesbians until the 1990s, until we were kind of on the other side of that AIDS epidemic. Um, and part of a piece of policy that helped emphasize, uh, the problems that people who were homosexual faced in getting recognition for their intimate relations, their partners, was the military's "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy, and then of course the Defense of Marriage Act, passed in 1996, which defined marriage as being between a man and a woman. Um, so, when you have policies like that that were basically blatantly kind of excluding, gay couples from, the rights and privileges that come along with being married, things related to insurance coverage, things related to benefits, things that related to, being someone's medical, closest relative. This is kind of what stirred up this fight. And certainly we're talking about from the mid 1990s until 2015, there have been a lot of shifts, both in the world of public policy, but also in the world of just attitudes and opinions. And so, as I noted, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed in 1996, and it was the law of the land, for really like almost, over 10 years. And so different states and different cities maybe would pass laws to try to acknowledge, same-sex marriages, but they were at risk of, running afoul of the kind of federal policy. So in 2009, when President Obama, former President Obama, declared that DOMA was unconstitutional, and that under his presidency, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, was no longer going to defend it in court. What quickly happened was there, in a lot of states, there started to be cases and pushback against state laws, and state statutes and amendments that prohibited same-sex marriage. And so, in 2013, basically the Supreme Court struck down DOMA. They said, hey, it's unconstitutional. And so once they said that, some states pretty, quickly approved same-sex marriage. 17 states and the District of Columbia approved same-sex marriage, allowed same-sex marriage, by 2014. But that still meant that it was prohibited in 33 states. And finally, a year later, in the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court held that states had to allow same-sex couples to marry, and they had to recognize same-sex marriages from other states. And so, at the time that this decision was made, there were about 390,000 married same-sex couples in the United States, but there were another 1.2 million adults who were living in same-sex domestic partnerships. And so, what we saw between 2015 and now, so in 5 or 6 years, is a dramatic uptick in the number of same-sex marriages, which of course, then, those marriages become the basis of families, right? Having children, adopting children. So once again, this is how a shift around sexual orientation has impacted, American families as an institution. So the second article that I'm asking you all to read for this chapter is related to that Obergefell Hodges case. So a lot of, well, I won't even say a lot of people, because maybe you hadn't heard of Obergefell v. Hodges, before I just went over it in that last slide. But even for people who have heard of the case, heard the names, they don't know the backstory. So I wanted you to read this article to get a little bit of backstory about the case that was at the center of this Supreme Court case. Now, it's worth noting, sometimes I get students that say, the Supreme Court shouldn't have decided this for the people. We should have let the people decide. But to just kind of give you a sense, even though there had been increasing public support for homosexuality, there had been increasing support for allowing same sex marriage, shortly after, or at the time of the Obergefell-Hodges decision, America was only slightly more supportive than a 50-50 split. And then, of course, if you were to then kind of map that on like a regional or statewide kind of map, certainly that support was dramatically less in certain states. So, this is like any other type of issue that has become a moral issue, or that the Supreme Court has had to weigh in on, everything from slavery to interracial marriage. In a country called the United States of America, we are definitely setting ourselves up for like a logistical nightmare when, your marriage and all of the rights and privileges and benefits that come along with being married are recognized in this handful of states, but not recognized in this handful of states. That wasn't just going to be that was not going to be a long-term solution. And, although I applaud the nation for becoming more tolerant, who knows when we would have gotten to the point where in every single state, the majority of citizens would have, agreed and allowed for same-sex marriage. So, this is just one of the cases where, and, same thing with interracial marriage. The Supreme Court kind of had to set a precedent, as opposed to letting people lead, because certainly letting the people and their attitudes towards a minority population be the deciding factor on what rights we do and don't allow that population, it is probably going to result in those minorities, be them racial, be them sexual minorities. What's going to happen is they're going to be stuck without the rights of other citizens for some undetermined length of time until majority opinion changes. And so, and your book just makes this point, right? That, people saying a behavior is morally acceptable. They talk about several behaviors here: infidelity, abortion, same sex relationships, having a baby outside of marriage. You can see that, we have across all of these behaviors increasing tolerance. The only one that hasn't really increased is abortion, which still just kind of remains at a stalemate. The people who thought it was morally acceptable in 2001 are probably, I guess, the same people who feel that way in 2019. But pretty much every other behavior, even things like, infidelity, there has been an increase in the number of people who say, hey, that's acceptable. And if you're looking at it, in terms of difference, maybe the greatest shift in opinion has been in regards to same-sex intimacy. Now, like I've indicated several times, when we're looking at America and its opinions about same-sex, relationships and sexual minority identities, we need to be very clear that the acceptance and the tolerance and the views, they can vary by region, they can vary by age, and, certainly one established trend is they can vary by religion. As your book notes, historically, homosexuality has faced the harshest moral condemnation from the most religious from most religious denominations in the United States. And even today, pretty much consistently across opinion polls, people affiliated with a religion are much more likely to consider homosexuality unacceptable than those who are unaffiliated. That is the statistical generalization there. That doesn't mean that everyone who is religious has these attitudes, everyone who's religious is intolerant towards homosexuality. It does mean that the statistical evidence suggesting that the religion is a significant factor in helping us predict the likelihood that someone finds homosexuality acceptable or non-acceptable. Although, and I just give you a sample poll from Statista, you know, how negative the attitudes are, you know, the level of support that they have for homosexuals in various institutions, you know, even among religions, this can vary based on specific religions, specific religious denominations. And then of throwing in race also can then influence, you know, the intersection of race and religion also can change the influence. And so, you know, you can kind of look at that chart and see, you know, what groups are more or less accepting of, in this case, the question they were asked was about small businesses serving or not having to serve homosexuals. So that's kind of playing on some of those controversies we've had in the last couple of years about, you know, can a bakery decide that they, you know, aren't going to make a wedding cake because the couple is gay, or can a wedding venue prohibit people who are in a same-sex relationship from using their venue to get married. So, you know, we've seen those court cases. We've moved beyond, you know, marriage being acceptable because the Supreme Court has pretty much declared that it is. So we don't have those types of cases anymore. The next wave of cases and concerns has to do with discrimination, not just in the world of work, but discrimination in the world of customer service. The next section in your chapter is a fairly short section, and is one that, you know, as a sociologist, I'm a little bit knowledgeable on, but this isn't my strong suit. So I'm not going to be adding a lot of additional material beyond, you know, what Cohen discusses, and that's kind of the biological basis of human sexuality. And so I found this cute video. Where they're talking about, you know, what determines sexual orientation, what makes someone gay, and they're also talking about to what extent is gender and gendered, you know, behaviors is that rooted in biology as well as their relationship between gender and sexual orientation. It is interesting. I'm not going to necessarily say I agree with everything, every argument that she makes, but certainly some very interesting points are made. And the name of the series is called The Big Think. So hey, you know, I encourage all of us to think about some of the big questions. But here is kind of some broad observations about what determines sexual orientation. There definitely seems to be cultural factors. And we know this because we can look at societies that have, you know, different sexual identities that are more or less accepting around sexual identities. And then we can look at the number of people who identify with that sexual identity. And we can say that certainly there seems to be a cultural factor. You know, if you say that this identity exists, if you make it non-stigmatized, if you know, provide legal protections and don't engage in discrimination against that sexual identity, it does seem to encourage people to be more likely to adopt and identify with that identity than if you did the converse, right? Not acknowledge sexual minorities, you know, not provide them any type of legal protections from discrimination and mistreatment. If you stigmatize those identities, you know, that does seem to impact the likelihood that people are willing to, you know, say, hey, I am not heterosexual. Biological factors, you know, like I said, there has been this increase interest in, you know, in the words of Lady Gaga, you know, is it true? Are people born this way? You know, and that the question is sexual orientation largely fixed at birth. There have been a lot of studies. There has not been, I would say, like strong concrete evidence one way or the other. There definitely seems to be, based on studies looking at genes and hormones, epigenetic research, particularly twin studies, you know, there has been some evidence that is supportive that for some individuals, there does seem to be a biological component to their sexual orientation. But then, of course, there are other individuals where that biological component is less prevalent, and so it does seem more like a choice, and as opposed to not a choice. But basically, we still have a long way to go before we can answer that question, um, confidently. But for people who are interested in that type of question, there is a growing body of research that you can turn to if you want to do more study on your own. And so, this is just some points from the book. And it's like the book says, if there is a genetic component, it does seem to be massively overwhelmed by other factors, those cultural factors. um, but yet, even if it's not purely genetic, there does seem to be something that people are born with that, like I said, for some people does make at least some amount of genetic basis seem like it is occurring. And so if it seems like I'm kind of wavering there, that's just because, like I said, we're not at the point yet where we can offer, a clear cut answer to the question. uh, you know, they talk about the fact that for a lot of sociologists, we are not big on the evolutionary perspective. And this comes up also when I'm teaching gender, right? We don't use the evolutionary theory to explain a lot of human behaviors. And that's because the evolutionary perspective, which makes the argument that human behaviors are instinctive, we don't have a lot of evidence that a lot of what we do as humans are instinctual. Like, you can apply that lens and interpret it, but that's not the same thing as showing, through research that we are operating on instinct when we have this preference or that preference in terms of our romantic or sexual interests. If we are looking at other species, it's just worth noting, as your book notes, that hundreds of other species display homosexual behavior. And so, once again, the best answer that the book offers, and this is going to be the answer that I just kind of parrot here, is that biological forces often operate in the background, but they are exerting a weaker influence than those contemporary social and cultural factors, which we just believe, as sociologists, matter more. And so this brings me to sexual behavior. Out of all of the parts of the chapter, this part is going to maybe be the part where I go most off book. So please keep that in mind as you're watching the video and you're taking your notes. Although pretty much I will make sure to hit, everything that's in the book, I do hit. I just don't necessarily do it in the same order as the textbook, and I do bring in additional material. So I already mentioned Alfred Kinsey, who, him and his colleagues at the Institute for Sex Research, which still exists, you can look it up. They have social media. They're still out there collecting research about sexuality. But, at the time when they, published their study of sexuality in the 1940s, it was groundbreaking. Nobody was engaging in this type of research, empirically collecting data about sexuality. And it was met with controversy. And even today, some of their research methodology has been questioned by social scientists. Did they blur the line of ethical behavior in this early research? But some of those basic findings do remain central to the study of sexuality, even today. And two of those basic findings, I've already kind of even discussed, which is that, first of all, the proposed categories of homosexuality and heterosexuality are actually continuum, right? They aren't just these separate categories. You aren't either heterosexual or homosexual, but in terms of your behavior, in terms of your attractions, you're probably on this continuum. And it's difficult to measure sexuality. It was difficult in the 1940s, and it's still difficult in the 2020s. But what can we kind of say about modern intimacy, modern sexual behavior, based off of research? So the big kind of point that Cohen makes is that sexual behavior is less constrained now than it was in the past. And he gives 4 reasons as to why that is. reason number one has to deal with birth control. Reason number two has to deal with the kind of shift around values in regards to sex outside of marriage, and how that's resulted in, less social sanctions for people who engage in premarital sex, extramarital sex, and so on. The growing independence of young adults has weakened the ties of parental supervision. So particularly for women, you're no longer going from your father's house to your husband's house, right? You have this time period in between where you're not married, you're in college, you're working, you're living your life, you're being single. And so, that has had a real ripple effect on sexual behavior. And then due to improving health and medical intervention, the fact that sex at older ages has become more commonplace. That's probably one of the more recent kind of advances. So in general, sexual behavior is now just seen as more personal and more intimate, and it's no longer as closely linked to the social requirement of reproduction. So when I teach about this in gender, and I think I mentioned it in chapter 2 when we were talking about the history of the Puritan and the Puritan families, in Puritan culture, the slogan was really "sex is for babies." Sex was just about reproduction, and now, of course, we have come a very long way from looking and thinking about sex through that pretty limited lens. So kind of that first kind of contributing factor was, of course, the fact that changes in reproductive technology has kind of divorced sex from its reproductive focus. And this has been the case ever since the pill became the predominant form of birth control in the United States. So beginning in the 60s. And although there are negative and positive implications associated with this development, what's most important is that the fact that hormonal birth control has allowed women to have a lot of control over their reproduction, and that a lot of this could be relatively private. So, before, when really the methods were a combination of maybe a barrier method like a condom, or the pull-out method, which is generally not very effective, women, had a lot less control in this scenario, as well as just, especially if you're talking about the pull-out or rhythm method, it posed a lot of risk in terms of unwanted pregnancy. And so that goes into number two. The pill is more effective at contraceptive than methods that women had been using previously. Although, it offers no protection against STIs, which we'll talk about, more about when we get to the section on STIs. And maybe the negative is that the pill is a hormonal birth control method. It does have health risks for women, and certainly the earlier versions of the pill, which were not well tested before they were sent to market. It does seem like those earlier versions of the pill did have some real negative health effects on women. But the fact that the pill, it's relatively inexpensive. It's pretty easily accessible. It allows women to have a full control over their reproductive decisions. This certainly has impacted and changed sexual behavior, people's willingness to engage in premarital, extramarital sex, to engage in sex without the fear that, that pregnancy was going to be a result. As we start to talk about some of the other sexual behaviors that change, that, and make some other points about modern intimacy, I want to introduce this idea of sexual deviance, that, in America, obviously I've already discussed the fact that homosexuality was seen as being deviant, going against approved and acceptable norms. But it's worth noting that even heterosexuality some sexual behaviors have traditionally been seen as deviant in our society. And I'm going to kind of structure my discussion around these behaviors moving forward, in around the, to what extent are they still seen as deviant today? So the four types of sexual conduct that have been traditionally seen as being deviant among heterosexual partners are premarital sex, which it's just what it sounds like, sex before marriage; extramarital sex, so what we call infidelity, sex outside of marriage with someone who is not your marital partner; promiscuous sex, a little subjective, right? But it's basically the idea that you are having a lot of sexual partners. And, what does a lot mean? That varies once again by race, by age, by region, by gender. But, traditionally having a lot of sex, having a lot of sexual partners was seen as deviant. Um, and then underage sex, which your book refers to as teen sex. And they had a whole separate section of that, section 6.5. So I will discuss that one specifically in that section. So let's talk about, based on our research, what can we say about some of these behaviors that have traditionally been seen as deviant? Are they still deviant today? Beginning with premarital sex. Well, it's worth noting that a full 95% of Americans are now having sexual intercourse before marriage. So probably no longer seen as deviant in most circles. If anything, it's now expected that sex comes before marriage. However, it's worth noting that a lot of this sexual activity does still take place between people who are in long-term relationships, and that, and some of those relationships might be under the expectation that they are going to lead to marriage. So people are engaging in sex before getting married, but in some cases, they still might only be having sex with a partner who they expect to be their spouse one day. And even though they're not married yet, particularly in America, there is this expectation of fidelity in a lot of sexual partnerships, even if they aren't married partnerships. Now, when we talk about promiscuous sex, this is where it becomes a little bit, the research, isn't quite as clear about how deviant or not deviant is this behavior today. Um, Research suggests that having a lot of partners is relatively uncommon. Only 10% of men and 7% of women have three or more partners in a given year. There is also, like I said, a kind of gendered aspect to this behavior, where although men and women roughly begin having sex around the same age, so 17 years is the average age of first intercourse for both men and women, but men ultimately go on to have more partners than women. And we'll discuss maybe why that is later in this lecture when we get to our discussion of the sexual double standard. The other kind of thing that can make questions about number of sexual partners and number of sexual experience a little bit hard to interpret is because, particularly for women, sex without consent is relatively common. Among women ages 15 to 44, 23% report that they've been forced to have intercourse. And so, of course, that complicates, our interpretation of someone's partner's over a lifetime if one or any number of those partners were non-consensual. So as I said, like when we're interpreting, why these behaviors have become more or less or why have they remained more or less deviant over time, one term that can perhaps help us understand, how these behaviors have shifted, is sexual scripts. So sexual scripts are basically society's uh, telling us kind of whom we should desire and what we should do, right? It's kind of society's rules or guidebook around human sexuality, and the expectations do differ based on gender, and they do differ, based on sexual orientation. So, what society tells gay men might be different than what society tells heterosexual men, and what society tells heterosexual men might be different than what society tells heterosexual women. But the idea is that, these scripts exist on a societal level. So whether you accept them, whether you reject them, whether you believe them, whether you don't believe them, whether you try to tweak them and make them your own, is the sense that for a lot of people in a given society, there is awareness that these scripts exist because they pop up on TV shows and in other forms of media. They pop up in, the Cosmo articles, how to please your man. They pop up on PSAs about, true love waits, right? These scripts are embedded in our society in a variety of ways. And so the idea is that, if you're a member of a society and you're even, semi-aware, of what's going around, what's going on around you, then you are somewhat aware of these scripts, even if you don't know that that is what they're called. So a good example of a sexual script is like the persistent of the bases analogy, right? So if baseball is the American sport, the idea that at some point we started describing the progression of sexual intimacy using the basis analogy, the fact that we use that, as the form of analogy is it makes sense, right? It's the idea everyone knows baseball, everyone knows how, running the bases works. So then you apply that same thought through to sexual intimacy. Now, of course, scripts change over time. So traditional scripts versus contemporary scripts. And so even with the bases analogy, what the bases are now might be very different than what the bases were when I was growing up, which probably was different than what the bases were when my mom was in high school. And so that's true for all sexual scripts. So the messages that we give heterosexual women today might be very different than the messages that we gave heterosexual women 50 years ago. And that's because the cultural values and beliefs and expectations of about behavior, they do change over time. And so the scripts come from that cultural material. So the scripts are going to change over time. So a common sexual script, and the one that your book talks about, without calling it a sexual script, is the sexual double standard. So the sexual double standard is the practice of applying stricter moral and historically even legal controls to women's sexual behavior than to men's. And even if you've never heard of the sexual double standard, maybe you've heard like the slut versus stud type of comparison. A man who sleeps with a lot of women is called a stud. A woman who sleeps with a lot of men is called a slut. And historically, this is mean this has meant both informal and formal codes that were applied to women's behavior. Uh, Certainly, expectations around fidelity were much more closely regulated for women than they were for men. Men could leave their wives if she was unfaithful. There earlier time periods in American history, women saying your spouse was unfaithful was not going to be claims for divorce, wasn't going to be a successful grounds for divorce. Informally, it really just has to do with expectations about what proper behavior looks like for women versus men. So women must not initiate sex, which leads to something called the push and resist dynamic, right? Men are supposed to initiate sex, they're supposed to push, women are supposed to resist. Women who don't resist, women who give in too easily, let alone women who push, are seen as being, what? Sluts, thirsty, desperate, chasing men, that type of language. While, of course, men who push for sex are really just seen as being men, right? There is no, negative kind of term um, uh, that goes along with that behavior, unless he's super pushy and super unsuccessful, in which case, contemporary scripts have developed terms for those types of men. Women must be passive sexually. They should not have multiple sexual partners, particularly at one time period, right? That expectation of fidelity that exists even outside of marriage, but particularly for women. Um, Although, like I said, the expectations around premarital sex have shifted historically, even though as a culture we said premarital sex was wrong. You go back to the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, it wasn't seen as wrong for men to be sexually experienced as it was for a woman to be having sex and be sexual experience. And so the Madonna whore dichotomy, which is kind of the more historical version, of the slut versus stud, instead of comparing men and women, you're just comparing two types of women. The supposed Madonna, who is virginal, right, who waits until marriage, is a good girl, and then the whore, who is not virginal and who is stigmatized sexually and who is seen as being a less desirable long term mate, potential spouse. Um, Sex does not need to be enjoyable for women. I think that is one script that is changing, but certainly historically, it's been seen as sex is over when the man comes, when the man finishes. There was less concern about women finishing. And so there is this whole, set of research that talks about the orgasm gap. If you're interested, you can look to my YouTube page for the chapter that I do on sexuality for my gender class, because I talk about the orgasm gap in detail in that class. And then alternatively, men are expected to be more promiscuous. So although it's maybe not as stigmatizing for, women who are promiscuous are stigmatized. Men who aren't promiscuous aren't necessarily stigmatized, but for men, there is less of a positive association with being virginal. I mean, even today in modern society or fairly modern society, think about when that movie, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, came out. Would that movie have been as funny if the lead was a woman, right? The added humor seemed to be the fact that a man could wait so long to have sex. And that's because the sexual script for men is, of course, that they are supposed to be sexual and more sexual than women. And so, your book makes some points about the sexual double standard. It has become less universal, and certainly birth control has played a role in that. However, people still do apply it to varying degrees, and it is the prevailing sentiment in some areas and some communities, particularly, like I said, this is where region and religion and race can become very important intersections, because the sexual double standard might play out very differently, in a multi-ethnic big city like LA and New York versus a small, town where a lot of people are, Catholic or evangelical Protestants. If you're applying the sexual double standard, particularly to understanding the behaviors that occur within families, then, uh, you know, um, it's just worth noting that what this leads to is parents usually try to police their daughter's sexual behavior much harder than sons. And I personally, and sometimes this comes up with proms, or you see memes about like daughters dating, and it's like the dad, like, with his shotgun. And, some people think that that's cute, but really just think about the gender and sexuality messages that are kind of going on there. That idea that young women's sexuality, don't belong to them, but to their family, particularly, that their dads need to protect and regulate it. It becomes significantly more gross when you think about it that way. Um, you know, I kind of said that sexual scripts, part of why we accept them and we think about them as being normal and we normalize them is because we get sexual scripts in so many varied cultural forms, and oftentimes they aren't overt. Like they aren't like saying like, "Hey, it's okay for guys to sleep around and it's not okay for women." They're much more subtle than that. And so, if you think about subtle versions, an example that I usually bring up in class is like Drake and, that song Hotline Bling, which at one point was everywhere, and it's basically him moaning about, the fact that someone he used to date has had the audacity to go on with her life, right? He's talking about her behavior as if she's the world's worst person, when in reality, like look at the lyrics. Because ever since I've left the city, you started wearing less and going out more, glasses of champagne out on the dance floor, hanging with some girls I've never seen before. It sounds like Homegirl is living her best life. And of course, if you have, seen any other Drake lyrics and songs about his own behavior, there's a lot of stuff about hooking up with, big bootied strippers. So, this is what I mean when I say like these sexual scripts are embedded in our cultural content in such a way that we oftentimes, unless we're looking for it, unless we're being particularly analytical and sociological in our approach, they'll go unnoticed. So, the third article I want you to read is about double standards, particularly in the context of campus hookups, because once again, if you're interested in hookup culture, that's a topic that I talk about in my gender class when we get to that chapter on sexuality. So you're welcome to, turn to that video to learn more about that. But, for people who study sexual behavior, especially sexual behavior of college students, the fixation with hookup culture has played out strongly in the last 10 to 15 years. And so this author is talking about hookup culture and how hookup culture, despite young women wanting to feel empowered by these sexual decisions, part of why they sometimes find themselves disempowered and stigmatized on their campus communities is because it is very hard to have an equitable hookup culture, in a cultural context where double standards exist. I think this is a really interesting article. So I will be interested in reading your thoughts on the discussion forum. So before we talk about infidelity, which was another one of those sexual deviant, traditionally sexually deviant heterosexual behaviors, let's just talk about what we know about sex and long-term relationships. On average, married couples report having sex a little less often than once a week. And so this is where, the perception versus reality of being single versus being married is becomes really important, because we perceive single people as having this much better sex life. But oftentimes, although single people may have more choices, married people on average have more sex and report higher levels of satisfaction. And that's because if you're single, no matter how hard you try to keep your dance card full and your bench, stacked with potential partners, the fact of the matter is oftentimes you might find yourself, going through periods where you're all alone and not having sex. And of course, married people don't find themselves in that position. And then the other thing about being single and having, multiple partners is, certainly sexual satisfaction does seem to be somewhat rooted in someone knowing your body and knowing what you're interested in sexually, and that comes with time. So if you are single and you're having experiences with new partners, or you don't stay with a partner kind of long enough to develop this rhythm, then it does impact your sexual satisfaction. And it's worth noting that sex within marriage has become more adventurous, it's become more honest, it's become seen as being a more important part of marriage. And this has been a steady trend beginning in the 1920s. And then, and then escalating in the 60s and the 70s, post women's movement, post the development and the proliferation of the pill. So for a lot of married couples today, compared to 100 years ago, they're going to say that sex is important, is something that they work at. And so the fact that a lot of married people are not unhappy sexually is a good place to kind of, is a good point to emphasize before we talk about infidelity. Um, it's worth noting that we don't always have the best. Infidelity is still stigmatized, and for a lot of people, it is still seen as morally wrong. And so, like anything that comes with a stigma, it is hard for us sometimes to get a good grasp on exactly how many people are encouraged engaging in extramarital sex. Um, People report knowing people who do it, more so than they report themselves doing it. Uh, a 2018 report showed that about 21% of men and 10% of women reported having sex with someone other than their spouse. The numbers become higher if the man is older, like over the age of 50. And so your book suggests that, maybe infidelity is becoming less common in the coming generation because it was seen as more acceptable, um, particularly for men, in earlier decades. Uh, we know based on research that some social situations are more conducive to extramarital affairs, like when families are separated by travel or migration for work. And although your book doesn't note it, we also know that technology has introduced a risk of extramarital affairs, both because of the ease of reaching out to people, of starting these affairs, but also because if you've ever heard the term emotional infidelity, technology makes it blur it blurs the line about what is acceptable behavior between a married person and someone who is not their spouse. Sexting and sharing photos and images and sexually explicit, conversations. That just wasn't something that uh, was regularly occurring before the rise of technology and social media and so forth. Another kind of recent trend that's really almost, still too new, and still, so uncommon that we don't have a lot of good data on it, is the rise of non-traditional couples and families who are engaging in what's called consensual non-monogamy, is sometimes called ethical non-monogamy. Cohen doesn't pinpoint this as a trend to watch, but I expect that it will be, particularly in some states like California, where you have a greater amount of couples engaging in this lifestyle than in other areas. And like I said, that final kind of sexual behavior that your book discusses is sex at older ages. And so it's not something that we necessarily want to think about. And it's not something that we've even done a lot of research about. But we do know that people remain sexually active into their 70s or 80s. And once again, this just kind of emphasizes that sexual activity that no longer contributes to reproduction can still occur because it contributes to personal happiness and fulfillment. And so older people are having sex within marriage, they're having sex with non-marital partners, and they're practicing masturbation. And like I said, although we don't have, research to compare it to, it certainly seems like it's become more common. And we'll talk about later, once again, how this is related to technological and medical advances. And so I give you an article that you maybe want to read, or not maybe want to read. I'm asking you to read about the sex lives of senior citizens. And it's an older article. So it just shows you that, this has been something that in the last, 3 decades or so has become of increasing interest to sex researchers. So, as I said, that kind of fourth form of traditional sexual deviance that can occur among heterosexuals was underage sex. And your book had a whole separate section on this entitled Teen Sex. And so they say, um, they say, it's a poorly defined issue. And part of it is because it's not always clear, what we're referring to, what we're focusing on when we're talking about teen sex. But your book is referring to teen sex as sex that involves unmarried people between the ages of 13 to 18. And it's specifically about voluntary sex between teenagers. So it's not about rape or sex between teenagers and older adults. So we're not talking about statutory rape, but we're also not talking about teen marriage, because although some states have prohibited so-called teen brides, there are still, a lot of teenagers who, whether by force or by choice, are getting married at, ages that we would consider them to be more adolescent than adult. So your book is talking about non-marital sexual, consensual sexual relationships between two people who could be classified as being adolescents. So between the ages of 13 and 18. So what do we know about teen sex? It's a behavior that, although many individuals view it's widespread and increasing, in actuality, it's fallen. The number of teens having sex has actually fallen in past decades. Fewer high school students are having sexual intercourse now than 30, 40 years ago. So I sometimes joke, it's more about the generation X and the older millennials. It's about us being concerned about what our teenagers are doing based upon what we were doing in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s. But in reality, as the graphs kind of suggest, teenagers are not having sex at the same, ages and at the same rate, as they were in the past. Although, as your book notes, this isn't true for all sexual behavior, because oral sex has become more common. But if you're just thinking about, vaginal sexual intercourse, it has become less common, and condom use has actually increased. Other trends that your book notes, sexual activity is more common among groups that are socially disadvantaged. So, if they are lower income, if they have less education, if they're a racial minority, the likelihood that they're engaging in teenage sex is a little bit higher comparatively. But even among people from those backgrounds, once again, there is not a majority of boys and girls having sex before the age of 16. Like I said, other sexual behavior has become more common. And in some cases, some of this sexual behavior, like sexting, sending explicit photos, it is unique to this generation because of technology. So we can't really even compare it to what people were doing in the past, because they weren't doing it in the past. It wasn't possible. So if the research says that, teenagers are not having as much sex as we fear they are, why, what's up with the fear? What is our concerns? So your book talks about, when is teen sex a problem? It's a problem when it's non-consensual. And there is evidence that, that suggests that the lack of consensual sex among teenagers, among young adults, is concerning. The number of young people who have experienced a non-consensual sexual experience. It's a concern when it leads to sexually transmitted disease or unplanned pregnancy, which I'm going to talk more about. And it's a concern that because it can have serious emotional consequences. And so, so to a certain extent, teen sex is more likely to lead to some negative outcomes comparative to adult sex because of their poor emotional development and because they lack control over the resources and knowledge to care for themselves, in terms of their medical needs, in regards to the aforementioned STIs and unplanned pregnancies. But also, if they do have non-consensual sex, if they are a victim of non-consensual sex, they might not know where to go in the community, what resources are available to them to deal with that experience. So let's particularly talk about teen pregnancy here, because that is oftentimes the primary concern with regard to teenage sex. And that's because, for a lot of diseases, which I also will be talking about coming up, you know, a lot of STIs are no longer lethal. Even the most lethal of the STIs, HIV/AIDS, is not as lethal as it was 30 years ago. So the fact that a lot of parents, adults, you know, we conceive of STIs as things that can be cured with a pill, you know, in 5 to 10 days, means that we are not as concerned about teenagers um, you know, catching a STI as we are with about them getting pregnant. And our concerns about teenage pregnancy, of course, are based upon the kind of presupposition that, you know, if you have a child at an early age, it's going to derail your life. It's going to make it harder for you to accomplish the things, the steps that we know help facilitate mobility into the middle and upper middle class, graduating from high school, going to college, getting an advanced degree, getting a white collar job, you know, marrying, right? The fear is that having a child at a young age disrupts all of that, particularly for young women. And so this issue rose to prominence actually after the 1960s. And that's because it wasn't that teenage sex and teenage pregnancy wasn't an issue before the 1960s, but pre-1960s, that issue was solved in ways like forcing people to get married, right? You know, whether that force was by coercion or actual force, because keep in mind, the term shotgun wedding originates from those earlier kind of time periods in American history, right? Where men would be forced to marry a girl, a woman that they impregnated, you know, outside of marriage. But after the 1960s, post women's rights movement, you know, post Title IX, you know, with the push for women to go to college, to have their occupations, the tendency to marry during a pregnancy dropped. And so, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, teen pregnancy led to single motherhood and all the accompanying concerns around poverty and a cycle of poverty. Of course, you know, after Roe v. Wade, abortion became a much more common consequence of teenage pregnancy as well. So in 1995, President Bill Clinton declared teenage pregnancy a national crisis. And that's because, especially when compared to our other, you know, fully industrialized capitalist nations, you know, in Europe in particular, but also even some Asian countries, America had a much higher rate of teenage mothers than these other countries. And so a lot of resources were given to public health you know, offices throughout the country to try to address teenage pregnancy. And since the 1990s, teenage pregnancy has declined, and we'll talk about maybe what contributed to that decline in upcoming slide. But despite this decline, it's worth noting that the teenage pregnancy rate in the US still remains higher than most other industrialized nations. And you can kind of see by that chart, like, yeah, if we're comparing ourselves to Afghanistan or Mali, we're looking pretty good. But if we are comparing ourselves to, you know, the United Kingdom or Canada or France or Sweden or Japan, you know, our rate is still high. So I do have a article that I want you to read that sheds more light about this. It's from the Pew Research Center, and it's called "Why is the Teenage Birth Rate Falling?" I thought I had another slide. I guess I did not. So, you know, just know, of course, that certainly there's a sociological term called moral panics, right? Where we are super concerned that a behavior is happening and we're very worried about the consequences, even when the research suggests that this behavior is not occurring at the rates that we fear and or is not as problematic as we fear. And I feel like that teenage pregnancy is still just a good example of a moral panic, right? You know, we still, you know, have this image that a teen mother has wasted her life. And so we conflate teenage sexuality with this risk of pregnancy, even as birth control has become more effective and there are long-term options. And there are some states that allow teens to seek out these long-term options, even without parental consent, which we know that these are factors that have impacted the teenage pregnancy rate. And it's really only communities where these types of methods are not encouraged or are strictly prohibited to teens without parental consent that this rate still remains high. So this is just a good example of something that we as a society really are concerned about, even if the numbers and the research doesn't suggest that it is as concerning as we fear. So the next section just has to deal with sexuality and health in general. So this is the section where there's a lot of talk about STDs, which we now use the term STIs to lessen the stigma around them. A lot of our awareness around all STDs, STIs skyrocketed in the 1980s, because this is when the AIDS epidemic began, and we were just having a discussion about the health risks that go along with risky, sexual behavior. There are more than 50 kinds of STIs. And, even today, there are about 20 million new STI infections each year. And of those, about half of them happen to people who are under the age of 25. So there is a real age-related factor that goes along with the likelihood. And I'm sure, you can put on your sociological hat and you can offer some interpretations about why this is the case. The most common STD, STI is HPV, which is largely symptomless. So oftentimes, particularly in men, they are not even necessarily aware that they are infected. Women are more likely to be aware that they are infected because of the fact that women receive pap smears. An effective HPV vaccine has been developed, and it works if administered to girls and boys before their first sexual encounter. Intercourse encounter. There was some pushback about parents because people didn't like the idea of vaccinating their child, and having this discussion about sex, at early ages, but it really is effective. And so for public health educators, it is something that they strongly encourage. So part of how we have addressed, STIs and teen pregnancy has been through sex education, which your book notes is essential to help people take actions necessary to protect themselves. And sex education can come from a variety of actors. It can come from your parents, it can come from the media, it can come from public officials. But if you're thinking about, it taking place formally in schools, when it occurs in schools, it kind of takes the form of two broad types. It can be what we call comprehensive sexuality education or abstinence only. So comprehensive sexuality education is, as the word says, comprehensive. They talk about, a variety of birth control methods. They talk about abortion. They also talk about abstinence. Some of the more progressive comprehensive sex education curriculums, talk about, sexuality, broader speaking, in terms of pleasure and orgasms and sex that happens outside of, heterosexual partnerships, right? So they talk about, homosexual sexual intimacy as well. Abstinence only pretty much only focuses on abstinence, and in some cases they are strictly prohibited of even really teaching about any other forms of birth control, or if they teach about them, they overemphasize their lack of effectiveness, which and which isn't necessarily true. Yes, the only effective method is to not have it, but it's worth noting that certainly a lot of hormonal birth control, especially some of our long-term hormonal birth control, it has effectiveness rates in the 99 percentile. But abstinence only education doesn't really emphasize that. Now, part of why abstinence only education is super common in some parts of the country has to do with the federal Title V abstinence only funding that was provided during the presidency of George W. Bush that gave school systems extra money if they agreed to teach only the abstinence only curriculum. And so some states did accept this extra money, and they did only teach abstinence only. Now, if you compare who took the money to teen birth rates, you'll see that a lot of states that preach abstinence only have very high teen birth rates. And, it is really easy to understand why. Abstinence only works if people are, in fact, abstinent. If teenagers aren't abstinent, then the fact that they have only received abstinence only education means that they are woefully uneducated about how to protect themselves from both STIs as well as pregnancy. So when you're thinking about, what do we do as a nation, it really varies by state. Some states have, laws that say you have to teach sex ed and it has to be comprehensive. Some states have laws that say you have to teach sex ed, but it has to be abstinence only. Some states say you don't have to teach it at all, but if you do teach it, it has to be comprehensive. And some states say, you don't have to teach it, but if you do, it has to be abstinence only. So, what young people know about sex dramatically varies based upon where they live. Sorry about that. I had to take a pause. I somehow just managed to dump a whole cup of coffee on myself. And so, your textbook has this whole thing that basically says that, for people who study this, who study STI outbreaks, they use this kind of approach, the social network approach, which really can help us explain how, helps explain how diseases can spread in a social network. For my class, this is not super important for you to know. There does seem to be racial and socioeconomic inequalities in regards to STDs, STIs, that among some groups of people, there is a higher rate of infection. And some of that does have to do with, access to education, access to healthcare, but then also things like family structure and behavioral factors. And so if you were thinking about how do we address this, certainly addressing, racial segregation, the lack of sex education, and access to good medical care would be a good place to start. The final kind of health, topic that your book touches on was, related to erectile dysfunction. I'm not going to say a lot here, except, the fact that we have had pharmaceutical companies, develop drugs that allow men to continue engaging in sexual intimacy well into their later years, when biologically, for a lot of men, this just was physically impossible as they became older. This is a contributing factor to that increase in sexuality among older people. And the fact that pharmaceutical companies have these aggressive marketing strategies. I'll give you an example. This is from a magazine ad. This has reduced the stigma associated with ED. So there is less stigma for men in requesting these types of pharmaceutical, helpers, and admitting that they use them. And the final part of this chapter, was the trend to watch, and it was about pornography. So before I get into the points that Cohen raises, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page in regards to definitions. So pornography is the graphic depiction of sexual behavior through pictures and or words in a manner that is intended to be sexually arousing. Back when pornography largely existed in the form of like magazines and videos, it was believed that the primary consumers were men. Now that pornography exists on the internet, and we, this goes back to chapter 1 and that big data, now that we have the ability to subtly monitor, who is engaging and consuming pornography, we don't have to necessarily ask people about their behaviors. We can just kind of, cull from their internet history. We know that much more women are consuming pornography than what we thought. Men are still the more dominant consumer, but women are consumers of pornography at a much greater rate than what we believed, 15, 20 years ago. Sometimes there's a distinction between pornography, by using the terms obscenity and erotica. Obscenity is the legal term for pornographic materials that are offensive by general accepted standards of generally accepted standards or decency. There have been a lot of court cases about who gets to decide what is obscene, whose standards prevail. And these types of cases have been lodged against, magazines and videos. Currently in our country, obscenity has a much narrower and stricter definition than what it did in preceding decades. Erotica, these are materials that depict consensual sexual activities that are sought by and pleasurable to all parties involved. And so this is considered to be a more elevated form of pornography, because some pornography really seems to be predicated upon it not being consensual and it not necessarily even being pleasurable for women. And so erotica, with its emphasis on mutual pleasure and consensuality, is sometimes seen as being a distinct form of pornographic material. The one kind of form of pornography that is, strictly, regulated and restricted is child pornography, and that's because children are seen as vulnerable, and therefore worthy of protection. And there, are state and federal laws that prohibit the sale, the consumption, the ownership of material that would constitute child pornography. So now let's turn to what Cohen has to say about this. And his concern has a lot to do with the fact that, young adults, today's young adults have been exposed to porn more than the previous generation, where porn was more stigmatized and it was more difficult to access and it was more expensive. Porn has become less so of all those things, largely because of the rise of internet and similar technologies. And so a big question that researchers have is, does exposure to these pornographic images alter how people think about healthy and enjoyable sex? And long story short, there's conflicting evidence. There's evidence that people who watch porn are more likely to have an impersonal view of sex, and that there's evidence that pornography does contribute to conflicts within marriage. For some people, it does seem to lead to addictive behavior where it causes problems not only with sex, but other aspects of their social life. But there's also research that contradicts, how big of a role does all this play? And is it really impacting, family life in general or sexual behavior in general? And so, this is why he, identifies it as a trend to watch. This is going to be something that people who engage in sexuality research are going to continue to be interested in and to study. And so that is it for chapter 6.